The land out west, in the year of our Lord 1883, was a thing of harsh truths. It did not offer comfort, only existence, and that at a steep price. In the summer, the sun was a merciless hammer, beating down until the earth cracked like old pottery and the air shimmered with a heat that could drive a man mad. Dust was a constant companion, a fine, red powder that worked its way into the seams of your clothes, the lines of your face, and the back of your throat. Dust storms were not mere weather. They were biblical plagues, rolling in like furious, brown gods to scour the landscape, peeling paint from barns and hope from a man's soul. Then came the winter. It arrived without apology, a sudden, brutal fist of cold that froze the marrow in the bone. The wind howled down from the jagged peaks of the Rockies, a lonely, keening sound that seemed to carry the sorrows of all who had perished in this unforgiving place. Snow fell not in gentle flakes, but in blinding sheets, burying fences and trapping families in their cabins for weeks on end, the world reduced to the four walls of a room and the dwindling pile of firewood. Yet, life persisted. Ghostly herds of wild mustangs, their manes tangled and their coats the color of the dry earth, would thunder across the plains, a fleeting vision of a freedom most settlers had long forgotten. And from the scattered homesteads, a thin ribbon of wood smoke would rise against the vast, indifferent sky, a fragile but stubborn signal of survival, of a pot on the stove, of a life being lived against the odds. Luke Harrigan's smoke was one of those signals. His ranch was a sizable spread of land, earned through sweat and sorrow. He was a man carved from the same rock and dust as the landscape he inhabited, quiet, enduring, and weathered by storms both external and internal. His movements were deliberate, his words few. There was a stillness about him that some mistook for coldness, but it was the stillness of a deep, settled grief. 5 years had passed since he'd buried his wife, Sarah, after a runaway wagon had turned their world to splinters. 5 years, and the silence in his house had only grown louder. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of small things, the empty chair by the hearth, the spot on the wall where her needlepoint sampler used to hang, the cold, untouched side of the bed. Luke worked from sunup to sundown, throwing himself into the relentless demands of the ranch, mending fences, branding cattle, breaking horses, anything to exhaust his body so his mind would not have the strength to wander. But in the dead of night, when the only sound was the howling wind, the loneliness was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest. His nearest neighbor, a half-mile down a rutted track, was Clara Mae Thompson. She was a widow, too, though her loss was more recent. Her husband, a man with a quick temper and a heavy hand, had been killed in a barroom brawl 2 years prior, leaving her with nothing but a small plot of land and a reputation she hadn't earned. It was Luke who had helped her then, showing up at her door not with words of pity, but with a wagon full of firewood and a freshly dressed deer. He'd helped her fix the leaking roof of her cabin and taught her how to set traps. He never asked for anything in return, and they rarely spoke of anything beyond the weather or the price of feed. Clara had since carved out a life for herself with the same quiet determination as Luke. Her small plot was an island of defiant green in the brown expanse, a vegetable garden meticulously tended, a coop of clucking hens that provided eggs she sold in town. She was a woman who had learned to be self-sufficient, to rely on no one. She kept to herself, a solitary figure moving between her cabin and her garden, her face often shaded by a wide-brimmed bonnet, as if she were hiding from the sun, or perhaps from the world itself. It was the onset of another brutal winter that finally broke something in Luke. One night, huddled by the fire, the wind rattling the window panes like a restless spirit, he looked at Sarah's empty chair and felt a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was a coldness of the soul. He wasn't just lonely. He was beginning to feel hollowed out, a shell of a man going through the motions. He did not believe in love anymore. Not for him. He believed that part of his heart had been buried with Sarah, and the ground had frozen over it. But the need for a presence, for the simple warmth of another human being sharing the silence, had become an unbearable ache. With hands clumsy from years of handling rope and iron, he sat at his small writing desk and penned a letter. It was the hardest thing he had ever written. He wrote to a matrimonial agency back east, his words stark and practical. He described his ranch, his financial stability, and his need for a wife. He did not write of love or affection, only of partnership, of a shared life against the hardness of the land. He sealed the envelope and felt a strange mix of shame and desperate hope. He was a man buying a companion because he no longer believed he could earn one. Far to the east, in a world of green lawns, white church steeples, and suffocating propriety, Evelyn Hayes read his letter. Her world had recently been shattered. She had been engaged to a promising young man, the son of the town banker, and had believed herself to be on the cusp of a respectable, happy life. But a shadow from her past, a violent encounter she had suffered years ago as a young woman, had resurfaced in the form of cruel whispers. She had been wronged, a victim of a terrible act, but when she had tried to speak of it, she had been met with disbelief and suspicion. Her fiancé, fearing scandal, had broken the engagement, his love proving to be as fragile as the town's goodwill. The church, once a place of solace, became a hall of judgment. The pious whispers followed her down the aisles. She was seen as tainted, damaged goods. The letter from Luke Harrigan, a man from a land she could barely imagine, felt like an escape rope thrown into a deep, dark well. He offered no poetry, no promises of romance, only a new life in a place where no one knew her name or the stories they told about her. He offered a chance to be someone else, or perhaps, for the first time, to simply be herself. She packed her few belongings, turned her back on the accusatory stares and the ordered green of her old life, and boarded a train heading west. The journey was a long, jarring transition from one reality to another. The lush landscapes of the east slowly bled away, replaced by endless plains of yellow grass, then by the stark, raw beauty of the mountains and deserts. When she finally stepped off the train in the dusty, windswept town that was her destination, she felt as though she had landed on another planet. The air was different, thin and dry. The light was brighter, the shadows sharper. Luke had written that a neighbor would meet her. She stood on the wooden platform, clutching her small suitcase, a fragile figure in a dark traveling dress, feeling the curious stares of the rough-looking men who loitered nearby. Then, a woman approached. It was Clara. "You must be Evelyn," Clara said, her voice low and steady. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't unkind. Her eyes, a pale, clear blue, took in Evelyn's neat clothes and the exhaustion on her face with a single, comprehensive glance. Clara was the first person to show Evelyn the unwritten rules of this new world. She drove her out to the Harrigan Ranch in a small buckboard wagon, the silence between them punctuated only by the creak of the wheels and the jingle of the harness. She pointed out landmarks with a spare economy of words: the creek that ran dry in August, the ridge where the wolves sometimes came down in winter. When they arrived at Luke's homestead, he was waiting on the porch. He was taller than Evelyn had imagined, broad-shouldered and solid. When he took her hand, his grip was firm, his palm rough with calluses. He looked directly into her eyes, a flicker of something unreadable in their gray depths, and said simply, "Welcome, Miss Hayes." He was a man of even fewer words than his letters had suggested. The house was clean but stark, overwhelmingly masculine. It was clear that Luke was a man who lived without frills. Clara didn't leave immediately. She stayed, moving with a quiet efficiency that seemed to smooth the sharp edges of the awkward first meeting. She showed Evelyn to her small, plain room. "He's a good man," Clara said, as she helped Evelyn unpack her things. "Just quiet. It was both a reassurance and a warning. In the days that followed, it was Clara who became Evelyn's guide and teacher. Luke was a constant, steady presence, treating her with a formal, almost shy respect. But he was often gone from dawn till dusk. It was Clara who bridged the gap between Evelyn's old life and her new one. Clara taught her things she'd never imagined needing to know. She showed her how to milk Luke's cantankerous cow, her own strong, capable hands guiding Evelyn's soft, uncertain ones. She taught her how to build a fire in the wood-burning stove that wouldn't fill the cabin with smoke, how to knead dough for bread, how to tell which wild herbs were for medicine and which were for seasoning. Evelyn was a clumsy student at first, burning the biscuits and spilling the milk. But she was eager to learn, desperate to prove she was not the useless, delicate creature she felt herself to be. Clara was a patient teacher. A bond began to form between them, woven in the shared rhythms of domestic work. In the quiet afternoons, they would sit on the porch, mending Luke's work shirts, their needles moving in companionable silence. Evelyn found herself opening up to Clara in a way she never had with anyone else, speaking of the life she'd left behind, though she kept the darkest parts of her past locked away. Clara, in turn, listened. She rarely spoke of her own life, but there was an understanding in her eyes, a recognition of pain that needed no words. Evelyn had brought a wedding dress with her, a simple gown of white cotton lace her mother had made years ago. It had been meant for another man, another life, and wearing it now felt like a betrayal of a ghost. When she tried it on, she found that the journey and the sparse meals had made her thinner. The dress hung loose on her frame. "I can fix that," Clara said, her voice matter-of-fact. So they spent an evening altering the dress, with pins in her mouth and a measuring tape in hand. Clara moved around Evelyn, her touch professional and impersonal as she tucked and folded the fabric. She taught Evelyn how to make the tiny, neat stitches required to take in the seams. As they worked together, their heads bent close over the delicate lace. The air was filled with the scent of soap from Clara's skin and the faint, clean smell of cotton. The wedding was to be a simple affair, just a visit to the circuit judge when he next passed through town. As the day drew closer, Evelyn's nervousness grew. She knew Luke was a decent, honorable man, but he was a stranger. The life that stretched before her was a vast, unknown territory, as intimidating as the landscape outside her window. One night, a few days before the judge was due, Evelyn felt a sudden urge to see herself as a bride, to try and convince herself that this new life was real. The house was quiet. Luke had already turned in for the night in the small room off the main living area that had been his since she arrived. Evelyn lit an oil lamp, its golden glow pushing back the deep, menacing shadows of the cabin. She slipped into the altered wedding dress. It fit perfectly now, clinging to her waist and falling in soft folds to the floor. She stood before the small, wavy mirror on her wall, a pale, slender figure in the flickering light. She looked like a bride, but she did not feel like one. She felt like an actress in a play she hadn't rehearsed. A soft knock came at her door. "Evelyn?" It was Clara's voice. "I saw your light. Is everything all right?" "Yes, come in," Evelyn whispered. Clara pushed the door open and stopped dead in the doorway. She was holding a small jar of preserved peaches, an offering she'd brought over. The jar slipped from her fingers, shattering on the wooden floor in a mess of glass and sticky syrup. But Clara didn't seem to notice. Her gaze was fixed on Evelyn. In the warm, unsteady lamplight, Evelyn looked ethereal, a creature not of this harsh, dusty world. The white lace of her dress seemed to glow, her skin luminous, her dark hair a stark contrast. She looked beautiful, fragile, and achingly innocent. Clara stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat, and in that moment, something shifted inside her, a tectonic plate of long-buried emotion. The sight of Evelyn, this gentle woman from the East, standing on the precipice of a new life with the man who lived next door, unlocked a floodgate. First came a wave of guilt, sharp and suffocating. Guilt for the secret moments of shared grief with Luke, years ago, that had briefly, almost, teetered on the edge of something more. Guilt for helping this girl prepare for a marriage that Clara herself felt a strange, unwilling part of. Then came a ghost of memory, a flash of her own wedding day, the bitter taste of a union that had been anything but holy, a lifetime of hope turning to ash before it had even begun. And then, underneath it all, came something else, something fierce and unexpected, a painful throb deep in her chest. It was a hunger she could not name. It was not just for the man Evelyn was about to marry. It was a yearning for the beauty, the softness, the sheer, unblemished life that Evelyn represented. It was a desperate, protective ache mixed with a strange, dark possessiveness. For 2 years, Clara had walled off her heart, tending her garden and her chickens, surviving. Now, looking at Evelyn bathed in lamplight, she felt a devastating longing to feel something again. Her eyes traced the line of Evelyn's throat, the delicate curve of her shoulder visible through the lace. The air in the small room grew thick, charged with unspoken things. Evelyn saw the look on Clara's face, the shock, the intensity, and misinterpreted it, a faint blush rising to her cheeks. Does it look all right?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Clara couldn't speak. She could only stare, her mind a whirlwind of sin and memory, and a desire so profound and confusing it terrified her. She finally broke her gaze, looking down at the shattered jar on the floor as if seeing it for the first time. "I'm sorry," Clara stammered, her voice rough. I made a mess." She knelt down, her hands shaking as she began to pick up the large shards of glass, anything to avoid looking at the bride in white again. The moment was broken, but the echo of it remained, a silent, resonant chord struck between them in the dark, lonely cabin. The day of the wedding dawned clear and cold, the sky a vast, pale sheet of blue stretched tight from one end of the horizon to the other. A hard frost had silvered the land, making every blade of dry grass and every splinter of wood on the fences glitter in the early morning light. It was a beautiful, unforgiving day. Inside the small cabin, a fire crackled in the hearth, battling against the chill that seeped through the log walls. Evelyn stood in her chemise in the middle of the room, her hands clasped together, her knuckles white. She had barely slept, her mind a tangle of hope and fear. Today, she would become Mrs. Luke Harrigan. Today, her new life would officially begin. Clara arrived as the sun was clearing the distant mountains, her presence filling the doorway for a moment before she stepped inside, bringing a gust of cold, clean air with her. She carried the white wedding dress draped carefully over her arm. Her face was composed, her expression unreadable, but her eyes seemed to hold a shadow that the morning light could not touch. "It is time," Clara said, her voice even. There were no bridesmaids, no family fussing over the bride. There was only Clara. She helped Evelyn step into the dress, the cool cotton whispering against her skin. Evelyn turned her back to Clara, her heart beginning to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was acutely aware of Clara's presence behind her, of the subtle scent of soap and wood smoke that clung to her. "Hold still," Clara murmured, her voice closer now, just behind Evelyn's ear. Clara's hands came up to the nape of Evelyn's neck to begin fastening the long row of tiny, mother-of-pearl buttons. The dress was cut low in the back, exposing a narrow V of skin down Evelyn's spine. As Clara's fingers brushed against Evelyn's bare skin for the first time, a jolt went through both of them. For Evelyn, it was a sudden, inexplicable warmth that spread from that single point of contact, a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. It was a strange, intimate touch, more unsettling in its gentleness than any passionate caress she had ever imagined. She felt the blood rush to her face, a hot blush that crept up her neck. She stood rigidly, her breath catching in her throat, telling herself it was just nerves. The strangeness of being dressed for her wedding by a woman she barely knew. She remained silent, her eyes fixed on a crack in the wooden wall in front of her. For Clara, the touch was like putting a hand to a flame, the warmth of Evelyn's skin, smooth and alive beneath her fingertips, sent a shockwave up her arm and straight to her core. It was an agonizingly real confirmation of the chaotic feelings that had overwhelmed her the other night. Each button became a trial. Her fingers, usually so steady and capable, fumbled slightly. She had to force herself to breathe, to focus on the simple, mechanical task. The smooth pearl, the soft skin, the delicate lace. It was a trinity of sensations that overwhelmed her. A current, silent and unseen, seemed to pass between them, a live wire of forbidden awareness. She could feel the fine hairs on Evelyn's neck, could smell the faint, clean scent of her hair. The desire to let her hand stray, to press her palm flat against that warm, vulnerable expanse of back, was so powerful it made her dizzy. She clenched her jaw, her knuckles brushing Evelyn's spine with each button she secured, a torturous, fleeting caress. When the last button was done, Clara pulled her hands back as if she'd been burned. She took a half step away, putting a necessary distance between them. "There," she said, her voice sounding strained, husky. "It is done." Evelyn finally dared to look in the small mirror. The dress was perfect. She looked like a bride, but when she met her own eyes in the glass, she saw the reflection of Clara standing behind her, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin, tight line. The air in the room was thick with a tension that Evelyn could feel but not comprehend. In the days following that night in Evelyn's room, Clara had found no peace. Her sleep was ravaged by dreams she could not control. They were fragmented, frustratingly vague, yet deeply unsettling. She dreamt of white lace tangled in sagebrush, of the scent of lavender and lamp oil. In one recurring dream, she was standing on the edge of a deep canyon, and Evelyn was on the other side, holding out a hand, but a fierce wind kept pushing them apart. She would wake up with her heart pounding, the feelings of longing and loss from the dream clinging to her like a shroud. During the day, she was a stranger to herself. A profound disquiet had taken root in her soul. Being near Evelyn was a sweet form of torture. Every time Evelyn smiled at her, a gentle, trusting smile, Clara felt a painful twist of guilt and a confusing surge of tenderness. She found herself watching Evelyn's hands as she learned to knead bread, noticing the graceful turn of her wrist, the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. These small, mundane details became invested with a startling significance. Her turmoil manifested as a sharp, brittle anger directed at the one person she couldn't avoid. Luke. When he came by her cabin to ask if she needed anything from town, she answered in clipped, dismissive sentences. "The judge will be here tomorrow at noon," he told her one afternoon, his hat in his hands, his gaze steady. "I'm aware," Clara snapped, not looking up from the weeds she was pulling in her garden. "She'll be ready." Luke stood there for a moment, a frown creasing the weathered skin between his brows. "Is something amiss? Clara, you seem on edge." "I'm fine," she retorted, yanking a stubborn root from the earth with unnecessary violence. "Just busy. A wedding doesn't plan itself, even a simple one." He knew it was more than that. Luke Harrigan was a man accustomed to reading the signs, the shift in the wind that foretold a storm, the tension in a horse's posture that signaled fear. And he could read the signs in people, too, though he was less comfortable with them. He saw the way Clara's eyes would follow Evelyn when she thought no one was looking. He saw the forced, brittle quality of her movements whenever the three of them were together. He sensed a current running between the two women, an invisible river of feeling whose source and destination were a mystery to him. And it stirred a ghost of a memory within him, something he had deliberately buried. It was from the week after Sarah's death. He had been hollowed out by grief, moving through his days in a fog of disbelief. Clara's husband was still alive then, a loud, brutish man who was away on a cattle drive. Luke had found himself on Clara's porch one evening, not knowing why he had gone there. They had sat in the twilight, not speaking for a long time. Then she had spoken of her own quiet sorrows, the loneliness of her own marriage, in their shared desolation. A powerful, unspoken understanding had passed between them. He had looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time, and seen the deep well of sadness in her eyes. He had reached out, his hand hovering over hers, the impulse to offer a comfort that went beyond mere neighborliness overwhelming him. But she had pulled back, ever so slightly, and the moment was broken. She was another man's wife. They had both recognized the cliff edge they were standing on and had stepped away. Now, watching her, he felt the ghost of that moment. He sensed she was on another cliff edge, but this time, he was not the one standing there with her. A knot of unease tightened in his gut, but he was a man who shied away from complexities he couldn't fix with his hands. He pushed the thought away, telling himself it was just women's nerves before a wedding. He nodded curtly and left Clara to her violent gardening. The night before the ceremony, a profound restlessness seized Clara. She paced the floor of her small cabin, the silence pressing in on her. She knew she should stay away, that her presence was a complication, a dangerous spark near dry tinder. But the thought of Evelyn, alone in that stark cabin on the eve of her wedding to a stranger, was an image she couldn't shake. She manufactured an excuse, a small, silver hairpin that Evelyn had dropped by her hearth a few days earlier. It was a flimsy pretext, but it was enough. Clutching the cool metal in her hand, she walked the half-mile to Luke's ranch under a sky littered with cold, distant stars. The main room of the cabin was dark, but a faint line of light shone from under Evelyn's door. Clara knocked softly, her heart hammering against her ribs. There was no answer. She pushed the door open a crack and peered inside. Evelyn was asleep. She was lying on her side, facing the door, one hand tucked under her cheek. The moonlight streaming through the small window fell across her face, illuminating the gentle curve of her cheekbone and the sweep of her dark lashes. Her breathing was slow and even. She looked young and terribly vulnerable. Clara slipped into the room, silent as a shadow, and gently closed the door behind her. She had meant to just leave the pin on the dresser and go, but she found she couldn't. She was rooted to the spot. She pulled a small wooden chair to the bedside and sat, an uninvited vigilante. She sat there for what might have been minutes or an hour, simply watching Evelyn sleep. The turmoil in her own heart quieted, replaced by a vast, aching tenderness. All the sharp edges of her jealousy, her guilt, her confusing desire, seemed to melt away in the quiet presence of this sleeping woman. What was left was a fierce, protective instinct. She saw not a rival, or an object of a strange new longing, but a soul as lost and lonely as her own. A gentle creature who had been cast into this harsh land and was about to be bound to a life of hardship. A floorboard creaked under Evelyn's bed. Her eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she was disoriented, seeing the dark shape of a person sitting by her bed. Then her vision cleared, and she recognized Clara's silhouette against the moonlit window.
"Clara?"
she whispered, her voice thick with sleep.
"What is it? Is something wrong?"
Clara's voice was a low murmur in the darkness.
"No, nothing is wrong. I was just returning this."
She held up the silver hairpin, though it was too dark for Evelyn to see it clearly. Evelyn pushed herself up on one elbow, the quilt falling away from her shoulders. The silence stretched between them, thick with things unsaid. Evelyn was the one to break it.
"Are you afraid of tomorrow?"
she asked, her voice small, almost childlike. The question hung in the air, simple and direct and devastatingly perceptive. She hadn't asked if she should be afraid. She had asked if Clara was afraid. It was a moment of pure, unintentional intuition, a recognition that the turmoil in the room was not solely her own. Clara did not answer. Words were useless. Treacherous things. They could not begin to describe the maelstrom inside her. Instead, compelled by an impulse, she made no attempt to resist. She reached out. She did not touch Evelyn's face or her shoulder. She gently, almost reverently, placed her hand on Evelyn's head, her fingers sinking into the soft, thick mass of her hair. She stroked it slowly, a gesture of profound, ambiguous comfort. Evelyn froze. The touch was not frightening, but it was intensely unsettling. It was a gesture of immense intimacy, yet it felt impersonal, as if Clara were comforting a frightened animal, or perhaps herself. She felt a bizarre mix of emotions, a sense of being protected, a prickle of danger, and a deep, resonant sadness. It was a kindness that felt more perilous than any cruelty she had ever known. She didn't pull away. She closed her eyes, leaning into the touch ever so slightly, profoundly confused and yet unwilling for the moment to end. After a long moment, Clara withdrew her hand, stood up, and left the room without another word, leaving the hairpin on the bedside table. Evelyn lay awake for the rest of the night, Clara's phantom touch lingering in her hair, the question she had asked echoing in the silent room. The wedding itself was as stark and unadorned as the landscape. It took place not in a church, but in the dusty main room of the town's only hotel, which doubled as a courthouse when the circuit judge came through. The judge was a portly, impatient man who smelled of whiskey and cheap cigars. He read the vows from a worn book, his voice a droning monotone that was occasionally drowned out by the noise from the saloon next door. Luke stood tall and solemn in a clean but worn suit. Evelyn, in her white dress, felt small and out of place. Her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke her vows. Luke's was a low, steady rumble. He placed a simple, unadorned gold band on her finger. It felt heavy and cold. The judge pronounced them man and wife, signed a piece of paper, and the whole affair was over in less than 10 minutes. They walked out into the harsh midday sun as Mr. and Mrs. Harrigan. Clara was not there. She had said she had things to attend to at her cabin, an excuse that felt as thin as worn cloth to both Evelyn and Luke, though neither of them commented on it. Her absence was a palpable void, a missing note in the strange, discordant music of the day. When they returned to the ranch, the cabin was just as they had left it, clean, quiet, and empty. But on the small wooden table in the center of the main room sat a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a simple piece of twine. Luke looked at it, then at Evelyn. From Clara, I'd wager. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she untied the twine and unfolded the paper. Inside was an old Bible, its leather cover softened and cracked with age. It was clearly a book that had been read many times, its pages filled with the faint scent of pressed flowers and time itself. She opened it. On the inside cover, in elegant, faded script, was a name, Clara May Weatherby, her maiden name. It was a relic from her past, from a life before she became Mrs. Thompson. Tucked between the pages of the Book of Ruth was a single, pressed wildflower, a desert primrose, its delicate yellow petals preserved in perfect, fragile form. And beneath the flower was a small, folded piece of paper. It was not a letter, not really. There was no salutation and no signature. There were only 4 words, written in Clara's neat, precise hand. Where you go, I will go. The life that began after the judge's pronouncement was a quiet, deliberate construction, built day by day like a stone wall. The marriage between Luke and Evelyn was a thing of gentle spaces and unspoken intentions. There was an awkwardness that clung to them, the shyness of 2 strangers tasked with the most intimate of partnerships. They moved around each other in the small cabin with a careful, measured grace, each afraid of disturbing a delicate, unstated truce. In the mornings, Luke would rise before the sun, his movements quiet so as not to wake her. He would have the fire going and coffee brewing by the time she emerged from her room, and he would hand her a cup without a word, a small, daily ritual that became their first shared language. Their evenings were spent in a similar, companionable silence. Evelyn mending his clothes by the firelight while Luke cleaned a rifle or repaired a piece of tack. The only sounds the crackle of the flames and the sigh of the wind outside. Their physical union was marked by the same hesitant sincerity. Luke was a patient, almost reverent man, his touch careful, as if he were handling something precious and fragile. He was driven by a duty to be a good husband and a deep, buried loneliness. For Evelyn, it was a comfort to be held, to feel the solid warmth of his body beside her in the vast, cold darkness of the prairie night. She was grateful for his kindness, for the safety he offered. But a deeper part of her remained dormant, a landscape within her that his gentleness could not seem to reach. She performed her duties as a wife with a willing heart, but it was the heart of a grateful ward, not a passionate woman. Luke, who knew the language of the land far better than the language of the heart, began to court his new wife in the only way he knew how. He started to bring the wild, harsh beauty of his world to her, sharing it like a secret. He decided she must learn to ride. He chose the gentlest mare from his herd, a calm, doe-eyed creature named Daisy. His hands were firm and steady on hers as he showed her how to hold the reins. "You don't fight the horse," he said, his voice a low rumble close to her ear. "You feel what it's going to do. You become part of its movement." He stood close, his hand on the small of her back to steady her in the saddle. And for the first time, Evelyn felt a flicker of something more than just safety. She felt the solid strength in him, the quiet confidence that came from a life spent in mastery of his environment. He took her on slow rides as her confidence grew. He showed her where the eagles nested in the high rocks, their forms like dark, lonely sentinels against the sky. He pointed out the tracks of coyotes and deer, teaching her to read the stories the earth wrote upon itself. He led her to a hidden spring, a secret place of impossible green in the midst of the dry, brown plains. It was through these shared journeys that Evelyn began to see the poetry of this unforgiving land. Luke would wake her before dawn, wrapping her in a thick wool blanket, and lead her to the top of a small rise behind the cabin. They would sit together in the pre-dawn chill, not speaking, and watch the world be born anew. The sky would bleed from inky black to a bruised purple, then to a riot of fiery orange and delicate rose as the sun crested the edge of the world. In those moments, the vastness of the landscape felt less like a threat and more like a promise, a canvas of profound and silent beauty. The sunsets were even more spectacular, a daily, dramatic death of the day. The sky would catch fire, painting the clouds in impossible shades of crimson and gold. The long shadows of the mountains would stretch like fingers across the plains, and the wind, which always seemed to be blowing, would whisper through the tall grass with a sound that was both lonely and soothing. In the fading light, the world seemed to soften, its sharp edges blurred, and in that soft light, Evelyn would look at the stoic, silent man beside her and feel a deep, burgeoning affection. He was a part of this land, she realized, shaped by its harshness but also possessing its deep, quiet strength. He was a good man. She told herself she was learning to love him. But a disquieting thread ran through the simple tapestry of their new life, the absence of Clara. After the wedding, she had all but vanished. She no longer stopped by with a jar of preserves or a basket of eggs. If she had something to give them, she would send the young Miller boy to deliver it. When Evelyn saw her in town, Clara would offer a tight, brief smile and a nod before finding a reason to be somewhere else. The easy companionship they had begun to build had evaporated, leaving a strange, hollow void. Evelyn found herself missing Clara with an intensity that surprised and confused her. She missed their quiet afternoons of mending, the steady presence of another woman in a world so overwhelmingly masculine. But it was more than that. She was haunted by the memory of that night in her room, of Clara's hand in her hair. She replayed the moment in her mind, trying to decipher the complex storm of emotions she had seen in Clara's eyes. She remembered the strange, potent current that had passed between them as Clara had fastened her wedding dress. It was an unfinished conversation, a question left hanging in the air, and its silence was a constant, low hum in the back of Evelyn's mind. She began to find excuses to walk the track that passed by Clara's small homestead, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. She would see her sometimes, a distant figure in a bonnet, bent over her vegetable garden, and Evelyn would raise a hand in greeting, but Clara would often pretend not to see, turning back to her work. The rejection was a small, sharp pain, and Evelyn didn't understand its source. She only knew that the one person who had made her feel truly welcome in this new world was now holding her at arm's length, and the loss of that connection felt profound. In the early fall, Luke had to be away for 3 days. A rancher 100 miles to the north was buying a small herd of his best cattle, and Luke had to lead the drive himself. He was reluctant to leave Evelyn alone, but it was a necessary trip. He chopped extra firewood, filled the water barrels, and made her promise to keep the rifle loaded by the door.
"I'll be fine,"
she assured him, trying to sound more confident than she felt. The thought of being completely alone in the isolated cabin was daunting. The morning he left, the sky was a clear, brilliant blue, but a peculiar stillness hung in the air, a sense of held breath. After he had ridden out of sight, a profound silence descended on the ranch. It was broken only by the lowing of the remaining cattle and the caw of a distant crow. The cabin felt cavernously empty. By afternoon, Evelyn couldn't bear the oppressive quiet any longer. She decided to bake bread, needing the comfort of a familiar task. But as she reached for the flour, she found the bin was almost empty. It was the excuse she had been looking for without knowing it. Clara always had flour. She pulled on a shawl and walked the half-mile to Clara's cabin. As she approached, she saw that Clara was in her small kitchen garden, harvesting the last of her tomatoes and squash before the first hard frost.
"Clara,"
Evelyn called out, her voice feeling thin in the wide-open space. Clara looked up, startled. A flicker of something, annoyance, panic, crossed her face before she smoothed it into a neutral expression.
"Evelyn, I thought you'd be keeping to the house with Luke gone." "I ran out of flour,"
Evelyn said, feeling foolish. "I was hoping I could borrow a cup."
"Of course,"
Clara said, her tone clipped. She wiped her earthy hands on her apron and led the way inside. Clara's cabin was smaller than Luke's, but it felt warmer, more lived in. Bunches of dried herbs hung from the rafters, and colorful. Handmade quilts were draped over the chairs. While Clara measured out the flour, Evelyn noticed a large pot of tomatoes simmering on the stove.
"Are you canning?"
she asked.
"Putting up the last of the harvest,"
Clara confirmed. "It's a long winter."
"I could help,"
Evelyn offered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them.
"If you'd let me. The silence at the house is very loud."
Clara hesitated. Her whole body seemed to tense, her shoulders rigid. She looked at Evelyn, at the hopeful, almost pleading expression in her eyes, and a quiet battle was waged and lost within her. For weeks she had starved herself of Evelyn's company, knowing it was a dangerous craving, but the loneliness in Evelyn's voice resonated with her own, and she found she was not strong enough to refuse.
"My hands are full,"
Clara said, her voice softening almost imperceptibly.
"An extra pair would be welcome."
A sense of relief washed over Evelyn. They worked together for the rest of the afternoon, falling back into their old, easy rhythm. They washed and chopped vegetables, sterilized jars, and filled the small cabin with the warm, savory steam of simmering tomatoes. The silence between them was no longer strained, but comfortable, filled with the simple, cherished purpose of their task. As they worked, the sky outside began to change. The brilliant blue leached away, replaced by a strange, bruised yellow-gray. The still air grew heavy and thick. The wind began to pick up. At first just a whisper, then a low moan that grew steadily in volume.
"A storm's coming,"
Clara said, glancing out the small window.
"A bad one.
You should go home now, while you can." But it was already too late. Even as she spoke, the sky opened up. The rain came not in drops but in solid, driving sheets, hurled against the cabin by a wind that now shrieked like a living thing. The world outside the window dissolved into a gray, violent blur. "You can't go out in this," Clara stated, her face grim.
"You'll be soaked through and lost in 5 minutes.
"You'll have to wait it out here." The storm was not a passing squall. It was a furious, settled assault. Darkness fell early, a thick, premature night. The wind howled, rattling the door in its frame and finding every crack in the log walls to whistle through. They lit every lamp and lantern in the cabin, but the small pools of light only seemed to emphasize the vast, raging darkness outside. They ate a simple supper of bread and stew, the sound of their spoons against the bowls barely audible over the roar of the storm. After they had cleaned up, there was nothing left to do but wait. They sat before the hearth, the fire a warm, dancing heart in the beleaguered cabin. The storm created a strange bubble of intimacy, sealing them off from the rest of the world. There was nowhere to go, no one else to see. There was only the fire, the storm, and the two of them. It was in this enforced intimacy that the walls they had built between them began to crumble.
"You never speak of your family back east,"
Clara said, her voice low, her gaze fixed on the flames. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, tracing the pattern on the quilt that covered her knees.
"There is not much to tell,"
she said softly. "My parents are gone. I have a sister, but we were never close. I was to be married."
"What happened?"
Clara asked, her voice gentle. The story that Evelyn had held locked inside her for so long began to spill out. She spoke of her fiancé, of the life she had thought she would have, and then, her voice dropping to a near whisper, she spoke of the reason it had all fallen apart. She didn't speak of the physical details of the long-ago assault. She spoke of the shame, the way the town had looked at her, the whispers that followed her. She told Clara how her fiancé, a man who had sworn to love and protect her, had believed the whispers over her truth.
"He said he couldn't have a wife with such a shadow on her name,"
Evelyn finished, her voice thick with unshed tears.
"He said no one would believe me, that it was my word against a man from a powerful family. It was easier for everyone to believe I was ruined. So I was."
She finally looked at Clara, expecting to see pity, or perhaps even a flicker of the same doubt she had seen in everyone else's eyes. But Clara's face was a mask of cold fury.
"He was a coward,"
Clara said, her voice tight with a rage that seemed to come from a deep, personal place. "A weak, frightened boy, not a man." The fierce, unwavering belief in Clara's voice was a balm to a wound Evelyn had thought would never heal. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek.
"And you, Clara?"
Evelyn asked, her voice still shaky.
"You never speak of your husband."
Clara's expression shuddered. She stared into the fire, her hands clenched in her lap. The wind howled, as if in answer.
"There is not much to tell,"
she said, echoing Evelyn's earlier words. "He was not a kind man." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "My father arranged the marriage. Mr. Thompson was a man of some means. That was all that mattered. From our wedding night, I knew it would not be a marriage of affection. He was a man who took what he felt was his right. He did not ask." Evelyn listened, her own pain receding in the face of Clara's stark, bleak confession. She understood now the source of the deep sadness she had always sensed in the other woman. Clara continued, her voice still a low monotone, as if she were recounting a story that had happened to someone else. "Before I was married, there was a boy, a ranch hand. We were fond of each other. My father found out and sent him away. He said I had brought shame on the family. She took a shaky breath. The night my husband died. He had been drinking. He found a letter the boy had written me years ago. He went into a rage. He rode out after him, swearing he would kill him. There was a storm that night, much like this one. His horse slipped on a wet patch of rock. They found him the next morning at the bottom of a ravine. The cabin was silent save for the fire and the storm. Clara had never told another living soul the full truth of that night. She had lived with the guilt, the relief, and the complex sorrow of it alone. Evelyn was weeping now, silent tears streaming down her face. She was crying for her own lost innocence, for Clara's stolen youth, for the quiet cruelties they had both endured. Without thinking, Clara moved. She shifted from her chair to the floor, coming to sit behind Evelyn, who was huddled on a braided rug before the fire. And then she did something she hadn't done in years. She reached out and offered comfort. She wrapped her arms around Evelyn from behind, pulling her back against her chest. It was meant to be a simple, comforting embrace. But the moment their bodies touched, it became something else entirely. Evelyn, expecting only solace, leaned back into the solid warmth of Clara's body. She felt Clara's arms encircle her, one hand resting on her stomach, the other on her shoulder. It was a profoundly protective gesture, an anchor in the storm of her grief. But for Clara, holding Evelyn like this was an agony of revelation. She felt the slight frame of Evelyn's body against hers, the soft texture of her hair brushing her cheek, the scent of her skin, the dam of her restraint. Weakened by the night's confessions and the intimacy of the storm, finally broke. The embrace, which had started as an act of comfort, was now charged with all of her repressed longing, her desperate, unnamed hunger. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. She held on tighter, her breath catching in her throat, an act that was both a giving of comfort and a desperate taking of it. Evelyn felt the shift. She felt the sudden tension in Clara's arms, the way her breathing had hitched. She felt the frantic beat of Clara's heart against her back. Slowly, she turned her head, her tear-streaked face just inches from Clara's. The firelight flickered in Clara's eyes, and in their depths, Evelyn saw no longer a friend or a neighbor, but a reflection of her own loneliness, her own yearning, magnified into a desperate, terrifying intensity. The roar of the storm outside faded to a dull murmur. The world shrank to the space between them. Clara's hand moved from Evelyn's shoulder, her fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw, before coming to rest on her cheek. Her thumb stroked away a tear. It was a slow, hesitant movement, a question asked without words. Evelyn did not pull away. She leaned into the touch, her eyes fluttering closed. And then Clara leaned in, and their lips met. The first touch was incredibly soft, tentative, a mere whisper of contact. It was hesitant, fearful, full of the combined weight of their pasts and the terrifying uncertainty of the present. But then, something broke open in both of them. The hesitation dissolved, consumed by a sudden, fierce wave of need. The kiss deepened, becoming no longer a question but an answer. A desperate, undeniable confirmation of a truth that had been hiding in the shadows between them all along. It was clumsy and urgent and achingly tender. A kiss that was not a beginning, but a collision. And in the heart of the raging storm, it felt like the only sane, real thing in the world. The storm passed as abruptly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening. The air was cold and sharp, smelling of wet earth and pine. When Evelyn finally stepped out of Clara's cabin in the pale morning light, the sky was a fragile, tender blue. The walk back to Luke's homestead felt like a journey across a foreign land. Every rock, every blade of grass seemed altered, charged with the memory of the night before. She felt altered, too. A new secret current of life was humming beneath her skin, a terrifying and exhilarating warmth that the morning chill could not touch. Luke returned the following day,
his familiar, solid figure on horseback a welcome sight against the horizon. But the moment he dismounted, the fragile peace of Evelyn's morning shattered. Guilt, sharp and cold, pierced through her. He was her husband. He was a good, kind man, and she had betrayed him in a way for which there were no words. He must have sensed the change in her immediately. Luke was a man attuned to subtleties, and the air in his home was now thick with them. Evelyn, who had been growing more comfortable in his presence, was suddenly skittish and remote. She avoided his eyes. Her answers to his questions about her time alone were brief and flustered, and she flinched almost imperceptibly when he placed a hand on her shoulder. The silence between them returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not the quiet of two people learning each other's rhythms. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of things left unsaid. It was a chasm that had opened between them while he was gone. Clara, meanwhile, resumed her disappearance, but with a new, final seeming resolve. The tenuous connection Evelyn had re-established during the storm was severed completely. Clara's cabin, visible from the high ground behind the ranch, became a symbol of a forbidden territory, a place of memory and longing that Evelyn could see but never again approach. The absence was a constant, dull ache in her chest. Evelyn was caught in a brutal, silent war with herself. She was adrift on a sea of conflicting emotions, her heart a compass spinning wildly, unable to find north. She felt a profound, sincere affection and gratitude for Luke. She admired his strength, his quiet decency. She wanted to be a good wife to him, to build the simple, honest life he had offered her. The thought of hurting him was a torment, but the memory of the storm, of Clara's arms around her, of that first cataclysmic kiss, was a fire in her blood. It was a memory that lived not just in her mind, but in her body. She would be churning butter or mending a shirt, and suddenly the feeling of Clara's lips on hers would return with such vividness that she would have to stop, her breath catching in her throat. It was a craving, a deep, resonant pull toward a feeling she had never known existed. It was a feeling of being seen, of being understood in a way that went deeper than words. With Luke, she felt safe. With Clara, she had felt alive. The two feelings, she was beginning to realize with a dawning horror, were not the same. To try and make sense of the chaos inside her, she began to write. She used the pages in the back of a small book of household accounts, her pen scratching furiously in the dead of night by the low light of a single candle. Long after Luke was asleep, she poured out everything, her guilt, her confusion, her fear, and the sweet, terrible memory of that night. He is my husband. He is a good man. I owe him my loyalty. I owe him my life. So why does my soul feel like it belongs in another woman's hands? Why does the memory of her touch burn brighter than the sun? To feel this way is a sin. I am a sinner. I have brought my ruin with me from the east, and now I will ruin this good man, too. She would write until her hand ached and her mind was raw. The pages filled with her frantic, looping script, but the relief was fleeting. The terror of the words being discovered, of her secret heart being laid bare, was too great. After a night of writing, she would rise before dawn, take the incriminating pages to the hearth, and watch them burn. She would watch the paper curl and blacken, her confessions turning to ash, the words of her heart dissolving into smoke and rising up the chimney into the vast, indifferent sky. But destroying the words did not destroy the feelings. They remained, branded on the inside of her. Luke watched his wife as a man watches the sky for a storm he knows is coming. He saw her distraction, the new shadows under her eyes, the way she would sometimes stare out the window in the direction of Clara's cabin with a look of profound, desolate longing. He saw the ashes in the hearth in the mornings, too fine to be from the logs alone. He knew something was deeply wrong, but he had no map for this kind of territory. He was a man of action, of practical solutions. He could fix a fence, break a horse or track a wolf. But he did not know how to mend a wound he could not see. His unease grew, a constant, low-grade fever in his gut. He found himself watching Clara's cabin, too, noting the absence of smoke from her chimney during the day, the way her small plot seemed less meticulously tended than before. The two women, who had been drawing closer, were now like two opposing poles of a magnet, repelling each other with a force that was palpable even from a distance. And his wife was caught in the middle, being torn apart. One evening, he was looking for a passage in the Bible Sarah had always liked, something from the Psalms. He wasn't a religious man, not in the church-going sense, but sometimes the old words offered a kind of comfort, a sense of order. He picked up the new Bible, the one Clara had given Evelyn. It felt strange in his hands, older, more personal than a new book. As he thumbed through the pages, the pressed desert primrose fluttered out, landing on the floor. He bent to pick it up, and as he did, he saw the small, folded note that had been tucked beside it. He unfolded it. The script was Clara's. He recognized it from the notes she had sent over with the Miller boy. The words were few, but they landed on him with the force of a physical blow. "Where you go, I will go." He sank into a chair, the note held loosely in his calloused hand. He read the words again and again. It was a quote from the Book of Ruth, a pledge of unwavering loyalty and devotion, a promise to follow another to the ends of the earth. It was a declaration of profound love, and it was in his wife's Bible, a gift from Clara. Suddenly, the pieces began to click into place, forming a picture he did not want to see. The memory of that night on Clara's porch years ago, the unspoken thing that had passed between them, the fierce, almost feral look he'd seen in Clara's eyes when she watched Evelyn, the abrupt, total severance of their friendship, and the deep, inconsolable sadness that now lived in his wife. He felt a cold dread seep into his bones. He had known, distantly, that Clara had carried a deep affection for him once, an affection they had both deliberately stepped away from. He had assumed, perhaps, that this note was a remnant of that, a message intended for him, but delivered through his new wife. But as he looked at the words, he knew with a terrible certainty that he was wrong. This was not about him. This pledge of devotion, this promise of a shared soul, was not meant for him. The intensity of it, the raw emotion coiled in those few words, was directed at the woman he had married. The truth of it was so strange, so far outside the bounds of his understanding, that his mind recoiled from it. But his heart, in its own quiet, intuitive way, recognized it. He was losing something. Or perhaps he had never truly had it in the first place. He sat there for a long time, the house silent around him, the small note a testament to a world of feeling he had not known existed. He felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, but it was quickly followed by a profound, weary sadness. He was not an ignorant man. He knew the world contained passions and griefs that the 10 Commandments did not cover. He looked over at his wife, who was asleep in her chair by the fire, her face etched with a tension that sleep could not erase, and his anger dissolved. He just felt lost. He finally confronted her a few nights later. The tension in the cabin had become unbearable, a taut wire that hummed with the slightest movement. He couldn't stand the silence anymore. He sat across from her at the small table after their supper. "Evelyn," he began, his voice rough, "we need to talk." She looked up, her eyes wide with a hunted expression. She knew this was it. "Something is wrong," he said, his voice flat. "It has been wrong since I returned from the cattle drive. You are not yourself. And Clara, she does not come here anymore. I need you to tell me what has happened." Evelyn's face crumpled. She looked down at her hands, twisting a loose thread on her apron. The words caught in her throat. How could she explain something she did not understand herself? How could she describe a feeling that had no name in her world? I don't know how," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Luke,
You have been so good to me, the kindest man I have ever known. I want to be a good wife to you, I truly do.
But, he prompted, his voice quiet but insistent. Tears began to stream down her face.
But something is wrong inside of me,
she confessed, the words torn from her.
There is a feeling. It is not a feeling I have ever known. It's different. It's not right.
She looked up at him, her eyes pleading for an understanding she did not expect to receive.
I feel something for her, Luke, something I cannot explain.
She did not say what that something was. She did not speak of the kiss or the embrace. She only spoke of the feeling, this strange, unusual thing that had taken root in her heart. Luke listened, his face impassive, carved from stone. He had expected denials, lies, a story about a petty argument between women. He had not expected this raw, incomprehensible confession. He looked at his wife, at her tear-stained face and her desperate eyes, and he saw not deceit, but a profound and painful confusion. He saw a woman being torn in two. The anger he had anticipated did not come. There was no rage, no righteous indignation. There was only a vast, hollow ache in his chest. He felt the floor of his world give way. The simple life he had tried to build, the quiet companionship he had sought, was dissolving into something far more complicated and painful than the loneliness he had tried to escape. He did not shout. He did not accuse. He simply pushed his chair back, the sound of the wood scraping against the floor unnaturally loud in the silent room. He stood up, took his hat from the peg by the door, and walked out of the cabin, closing the door softly behind him. He left her there with her impossible confession hanging in the air between them. Evelyn watched him go, a sob catching in her throat. His quiet departure was worse than any anger. It was a condemnation, a sign that she had broken something precious and irreparable. She felt a wave of utter despair wash over her. She had lost everything. She had destroyed the one good man who had ever shown her kindness. In her panic and desperation, there was only one place she could go. She ran from the cabin, her shawl clutched around her shoulders, and stumbled through the darkness towards the one faint point of light she could see on the horizon. She ran towards Clara's. She pounded on the door, her fists beating a frantic rhythm against the wood.
Clara, please, let me in.
The door opened, and Clara stood there, silhouetted by the lamplight from within. Her face was pale and drawn, her eyes wide with alarm.
Evelyn, what is it? What's happened? I told him, Evelyn sobbed, collapsing against the doorframe. I told Luke. Not everything, but enough. He knows. He knows there is something between us. And he left. He just walked away. I have ruined him. I have ruined everything. She was weeping uncontrollably, her body shaking with grief and fear. I came to say I am sorry. She choked out. I am so sorry. Clara, for everything? Clara pulled her inside, out of the cold night air, and kicked the door shut. She held Evelyn by the shoulders, her grip surprisingly strong. She looked into Evelyn's devastated face, and her own expression was not one of pity, but of a fierce, blazing intensity. There were tears in her eyes, too. Sorry? Clara's voice was a raw whisper. Do not be sorry. Do you know what you have done to me, Evelyn? She gave her a small shake, forcing Evelyn to meet her gaze. For 2 years, I was a ghost. I tended my garden. I collected my eggs. I breathed in and out, but I was dead. My heart was a stone. I felt nothing. She pulled Evelyn into a fierce, desperate embrace, her arms wrapping around her as if she would never let go. She buried her face in Evelyn's hair, and Evelyn could feel her own body trembling. And then you came, Clara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You came here, and you made me feel alive again. She was crying now, deep, ragged sobs that shook her entire frame. You woke me up. Do not dare be sorry for that. Outside, in the darkness, a figure had returned. Luke had not gone far.
He had walked out onto the plains, the cold wind a welcome balm on his turmoil. But he could not stay away. This was his home. That was his wife. He had to go back. He approached the cabin quietly, his boots making no sound on the soft earth. He had expected to find Evelyn alone, weeping by the fire. But the cabin was dark. A terrible fear gripped him, that she had done something to herself, that she had run off into the night. Then he saw it, the single point of light, farther down the track, from Clara's cabin. He walked towards it, his heart a heavy stone in his chest. He did not know what he intended to do. He stopped a few yards from the small window, staying in the deep shadows. He could hear the faint sound of crying from within. He moved closer, until he could see into the small, lamp-lit room. He saw them. They were not kissing. They were holding each other, locked in a desperate embrace in the middle of the room. He saw Clara, her face buried in Evelyn's hair, her body shaking with sobs. He saw his wife, her arms wrapped tightly around Clara's waist, clinging to her as if she were a lifeline in a raging sea. He saw their two forms, merged into one silhouette of shared grief and desperate comfort. He saw the truth, not the sordid details, but the undeniable, powerful reality of their connection. It was a bond that had nothing to do with him. It was a force that had been unleashed in his world, in his home, and he was an outsider to it. A profound, crushing desolation washed over him. He felt the land beneath his feet, the only thing that had ever been certain and true, shift and threaten to give way. He stood there for a long moment, a silent, unseen witness to the wreckage of his hopes. Then, with a quietness that was his nature, he turned around. He did not go back to the cabin. He simply turned and walked away into the immense, star-dusted darkness of the prairie, leaving them to their embrace, leaving them to the world they had created without him. Luke did not return that night, nor the next. The sun rose and set twice on a world holding its breath. Inside the main cabin, Evelyn and Clara existed in a state of suspended animation. After Evelyn's frantic arrival and their desperate, tear-soaked embrace, they had simply stopped. The storm of their confession had passed, leaving a quiet, unnerving calm. They did not touch again. They spoke in low, hesitant voices about practical things, the fire, the remaining food, the weather, but beneath the surface of their words, a new, terrifying, and unbreakable bond had been forged. They were two people who had seen the hidden truth of each other's souls, and now they had to live in the wreckage of that revelation. Evelyn was consumed by a gnawing anxiety. Every creak of a floorboard, every gust of wind, sounded like Luke's returning footsteps. She imagined his face, cold with anger, filled with a righteous fury. She imagined being cast out, sent back east in shame, a fate she was certain she deserved. Clara was quieter, her composure a thin sheet of ice over a turbulent sea. She watched Evelyn with a fierce, protective gaze, as if she could physically shield her from the consequences of the heart. On the third morning, Luke returned. He did not ride up to the cabin with a thunderous approach. He simply appeared, leading his horse, his face grim and covered in a new layer of dust and stubble. He looked as if he had aged a decade in 2 days. He had not gone far. Evelyn realized. He had likely been sleeping under the stars, wrestling with the demons she had unleashed. He walked into his own home and found both women at his table. He stopped in the doorway, and, for a long moment, the three of them were frozen in a silent tableau. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. Clara rose slowly from her chair, her posture defensive, ready for a confrontation. But the confrontation never came. Luke's eyes, hollowed out with exhaustion and a deep, soul-weary sadness, met Evelyn's. He did not speak to her. He looked at Clara. "You should go home," he said, his voice a dry rasp. It was not a command, but a statement of fact, a dismissal. Clara held his gaze, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. But she looked at Evelyn's terrified face, and her shoulders slumped. She nodded once, picked up her shawl, and walked out the door without a word, without a backward glance. The life that resumed was a ghost of what had come before. Luke was not angry. He was not cruel. He was simply absent. He was a body moving through the house, performing his chores with a grim, mechanical efficiency. But the man himself was gone. He slept in the small cot in the corner of the main room, a clear and deliberate barrier between himself and his wife. He spoke to her only when necessary, his words clipped and devoid of any warmth, the easy affection he had begun to show her, the shared moments watching the sunrise, the gentle guidance as she learned to ride. All of it was gone, vanished as if it had never been. He had built a wall around his heart, and it was a wall that Evelyn's guilt and sorrow could not breach. This cold, silent punishment was 1,000 times worse than any shouting match. Evelyn wilted in the oppressive silence. She tried to be a good wife, keeping the house spotless, cooking his meals, mending his clothes, but her efforts were met with the same profound indifference. She was living with a stranger again, but this time, it was a stranger whose heart she knew she had broken. Weeks passed in this miserable state. The vibrant colors of autumn faded. The leaves of the few cottonwood trees by the creek turned a brittle yellow and fell, and the air grew a sharper edge, hinting at the coming winter. The entire landscape seemed to be mirroring the state of their lives, bleak, cold, and stripped bare. The accident happened on a Sunday. It was the day of the annual church social, held in a grassy meadow down by the creek before the weather turned too cold for such gatherings. Neither Luke nor Evelyn wanted to go, but to refuse would be to invite the very speculation and gossip they were desperate to avoid. So they went, moving among the other families of the small community like two ghosts at a feast. Clara was there, too. She kept to the edges of the crowd, speaking to no one, a solitary figure in a plain, dark dress. Evelyn's eyes kept finding her, a magnetic pull she could not resist. Their gazes would meet for a fleeting, painful moment across the crowded meadow before one of them would quickly look away. The meadow was bordered on one side by a series of rocky bluffs that dropped down to the creek bed. It was a place the children were warned away from. But children's curiosity often outweighs their caution. The Miller boy, a rambunctious child of 7, was chasing a lizard, his shrieks of delight echoing in the clear air. He scrambled up the rocks, ignoring his mother's calls to come back. It happened in an instant. A patch of loose gravel gave way under his small boots. He cried out, a short, sharp sound of surprise and fear. And then he was gone, tumbling out of sight into the shallow ravine below. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Women screamed. Men started running towards the bluff, but Clara was the closest. She had been standing near the edge, watching the boy, a faint, sad smile on her face. Without a single moment of hesitation, she ran. She didn't scramble down the treacherous, crumbling path. She found a slightly more stable-looking section of the cliffside and half slid, half climbed down, her skirt tearing on the sharp rocks, her hands scraped raw. She reached the boy first. He was conscious, crying from a mix of pain and terror. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. As Clara knelt beside him, a section of the rock face above them, loosened by the boy's fall and her own descent, gave way. There was a low rumble, and a shower of rocks and earth came crashing down. Clara reacted with pure instinct. She threw her body over the small boy, shielding him with her own, taking the full brunt of the small landslide on her back and head. By the time Luke and the other men reached the bottom of the ravine, the dust had settled. The Miller boy was wailing, terrified but largely unharmed, protected by Clara's body. Clara herself lay still, a trickle of blood matting her dark hair, her face ashen. Luke took command. His movements were swift and sure, the paralysis that had gripped him for weeks vanishing in the face of crisis. He gently examined Clara, his touch surprisingly deft. "Her leg's broken," he said, his voice grim. And she's taken a bad blow to the head. He looked up at the anxious faces peering down from the bluff. She needs a doctor, and she needs to be kept warm and still. We're taking her to my place. It's the closest. No one argued. He and another man fashioned a makeshift stretcher from 2 poles and a horse blanket. They carried Clara's still, broken form up the treacherous path. Evelyn was waiting at the top, her face white with shock, her hands pressed to her mouth. As they passed, her eyes met Luke's, and in that moment, the wall between them seemed to dissolve. They were no longer a broken husband and a guilty wife. They were 2 people bound together by a shared, terrible fear. They laid Clara on Luke and Evelyn's bed, the only proper bed in the house. It felt strange and deeply, profoundly wrong to see her lying there, so still and pale, in the center of their shattered marriage. The town doctor was summoned, a gruff, capable man who set Clara's leg in a splint, cleaned and stitched the gash on her head, and shook his own head grimly. "The leg will mend," he said, packing his bag. "It's the head I'm worried about. She could be out for a day or a week, or she might not wake up at all. Keep her quiet, keep a cold compress on her head, and pray." The doctor left. The neighbors who had followed them to the cabin offered their help and their sympathies before eventually departing, leaving the 3 of them alone in the quiet, lamp-lit room. The silence descended once more, but it was a different silence. It was the silence of a vigil. Evelyn did not leave Clara's side. She became her tireless, devoted nurse. She sat in a chair by the bed, day and night, watching the faint, shallow rise and fall of Clara's chest. She bathed her feverish forehead with cool water, moistened her cracked lips with a damp cloth, and straightened her blankets 100 times. Luke would come and stand in the doorway, watching her. He would bring her food she didn't eat and coffee she didn't drink. He took over all the household chores, the cooking, the cleaning, the endless stoking of the fire, his movements as quiet and unobtrusive as possible. In those long, silent days and nights, watching his wife care for the woman who had come between them, something profound began to shift in Luke. At first, he felt a sharp, bitter pang of something that might have been jealousy. He saw the tenderness in Evelyn's touch, the desperate, pleading whispers she would murmur to Clara's unconscious form, a level of raw, unguarded devotion she had never shown him. The pain of it was a physical thing, a tightening in his chest. But as the days wore on, the pain began to be replaced by a slow, dawning understanding. He was a witness to a love of a kind he had never imagined. It was not a sordid, shameful secret. It was a fierce, powerful, and deeply caring force. He saw it in the way Evelyn refused to sleep, her own face growing pale and drawn with exhaustion, her entire being focused on the still figure in the bed. He saw that this was not a fleeting infatuation. This was a bond as strong and real as the rock and earth of the land he lived on. He began to see the 3 of them not as a triangle of betrayal, but as 3 solitary, lonely souls who had been caught in a storm. He had sought a wife to cure his loneliness, but he had only brought another lonely person into his own isolation. And that person had found a kindred soul in the other lonely woman who lived down the track. He began to understand that love was not a simple, finite thing, a plot of land to be owned and fenced in. It was a wild, unpredictable force, like the weather, and it took whatever form it needed to in order to survive. The pain was still there, a dull ache in his heart, but it was now accompanied by a strange, reluctant sense of clarity. On the 5th day, Clara's eyelids fluttered. Evelyn, who had been dozing in her chair, was instantly awake. She leaned forward, her heart pounding. "Clara," she whispered. Clara's eyes opened. They were cloudy at first, unfocused. They darted around the unfamiliar room before finally settling on Evelyn's face. A flicker of recognition, then confusion. "Evelyn?" Her voice was a dry, weak croak. Where am I?" "You're at my house, Luke's house," Evelyn said, her voice thick with relief. Tears streamed down her face.
"There was an accident. You saved the Miller boy. You've been sleeping for a long time."
Clara tried to push herself up, then grimaced in pain, her hand going to her splinted leg.
"The boy, is he all right?" "He's fine, thanks to you,"
Evelyn said, gently pushing her back against the pillows.
"You need to rest."
Evelyn took Clara's hand, her fingers wrapping around Clara's cool, limp ones. The relief was so overwhelming it was dizzying. She leaned in close, her forehead almost touching Clara's, her voice a low, intense whisper that was meant for Clara's ears alone.
"I was so afraid,"
she breathed.
"I thought I had lost you. I can't lose you, Clara."
She squeezed her hand, the truth of her heart finally boiling over, raw and unfiltered. "I love him, Luke, I do, but I want you, too. I want both of you." It was the most honest thing she had ever said, a confession of an impossible, greedy, desperate heart, a truth she had not even fully admitted to herself until the words were out. Luke was standing in the doorway. He had come in with a fresh basin of water and had stopped, unseen. When he heard Clara's first words, he had heard everything. He didn't retreat. He didn't turn away. He walked slowly into the room, placing the basin on the nightstand. Both women looked at him, their faces a mixture of fear and surprise. Evelyn snatched her hand back from Clara's as if she'd been burned. Luke looked down at the two women in the bed, one broken and pale, the other exhausted and tear-stained. He looked at their intertwined lives, at the pain and confusion and the fierce, undeniable love that filled the small room. He looked at the wreckage of his own simple hopes, and he thought of the long, lonely years behind him, and the long, lonely years that would surely stretch ahead for all of them if things continued as they were. He finally looked at Evelyn. His eyes filled not with anger, but with a deep, profound weariness and a glimmer of something else, resignation, perhaps, or a strange kind of peace.
"If that means," he said, his voice low and steady, "that all of us are no longer alone, then I agree."
The words hung in the air, astonishing and absolute. It was not a declaration of joy. It was not a celebration. It was a pragmatic, heartbreakingly sad, and deeply compassionate surrender. It was the choice of a man who had decided that a complicated, messy, shared life was better than a simple, empty, lonely one. The weeks that followed were a slow, awkward, and tentative dance. Clara healed. Slowly. She moved from the bed to a chair by the fire, and then, with the help of a crude crutch Luke fashioned for her, she began to move around the cabin. No one spoke of what Luke had said. No one defined what they had all agreed to. They simply began to live it. The three of them learned to navigate the small space, to exist in a delicate, shifting balance. Luke would talk to Clara about the ranch, about the coming winter. In a way, he no longer talked to Evelyn. Evelyn and Clara would fall back into their easy, quiet companionship, mending and cooking, their hands sometimes brushing, a silent current passing between them. At night, Luke remained on his cot. The big bed, now that Clara had moved out of it, remained empty, a silent testament to the space that still existed between all of them. But the world outside their cabin was not silent. When Clara was well enough to be seen in town, leaning on her crutch, the whispers started. The story of her heroism had been quickly replaced by the far more interesting story of her convalescence. The town had eyes. They saw that she had not returned to her own cabin. They saw the light burning in the Harrigan house late into the night. They saw the three of them at the Mercantile, a strange, quiet trio that did not fit any known pattern. The whispers grew into open speculation, and then into judgment. The church, which had praised Clara's selfless act, now condemned her living arrangement. The circuit-riding preacher, a man with fire in his eyes and brimstone on his tongue, gave a sermon on the sanctity of marriage and the sins of the flesh. his eyes seeming to bore straight into the back of the pew where Luke and Evelyn sat alone. He spoke of abominations, of unnatural unions, of the moral decay that threatened their small, God-fearing community. He didn't use their names. He didn't have to. Everyone knew who he was talking about. They walked out of the church that day into a sea of averted eyes and cold, pious stares. Their private, fragile peace had been declared a public sin. The fragile peace they had built was as delicate as a web of frost, and the first touch of the town's hot breath of judgment was enough to make it melt away. The whispers followed them like flies. The averted eyes in the mercantile felt like small stones being thrown. The preacher's Sunday sermon had not been a warning. It had been a declaration of war, and Clara knew they were a battle Luke and Evelyn could not win, not without a great and terrible cost. She saw the toll it was taking. She saw the new lines of strain around Luke's eyes, the way his shoulders were perpetually tensed, as if bracing for a blow. He was a man of quiet pride, and the town's scorn was a slow, grinding poison to him. But it was the change in Evelyn that broke Clara's heart. The tentative light that had begun to dawn in her eyes was flickering, threatened with being extinguished altogether. She walked with her head down, her movements furtive, as if she expected an accusation to be hurled at her from every doorway. The sanctuary they had built was becoming a prison, and Clara realized with a cold, sickening clarity that she was the lock on the door. The decision came to her not in a moment of passion, but in the dead, quiet hours of the night. As she lay awake listening to the sounds of the house, she heard Luke turn restlessly on his cot. She heard the soft, muffled sound of Evelyn weeping into her pillow, and she knew what she had to do. The love she felt for them, for Evelyn's gentle soul, for Luke's quiet strength, for the strange, impossible family they had become, demanded the ultimate sacrifice. She had to cut out the perceived sickness to save the body. She had to remove herself. She chose a night when a cold, miserable rain was falling, a sky weeping in sympathy with her own heart. The rain would cover her tracks and wash away the scent of her passing. While Luke and Evelyn slept, she moved with the silence of a ghost. She did not pack a bag. To do so would be to admit she was planning a journey, not simply disappearing. She took only a small loaf of bread, a canteen of water, and the sharp skinning knife Luke had given her. She put on her sturdiest boots and a thick, hooded cloak. She paused at the door of the room where Evelyn slept. The urge to go in, to press one last kiss to her forehead, to breathe in her scent one last time, was a physical agony. But she resisted. A proper goodbye would be a cruelty, an anchor she might not have the strength to slip. Instead, she left a note on the main table, held down by a smooth, gray stone from the hearth. It contained only 5 words. "To keep you safe, forgive me." Then, she slipped out into the drenching, black night. She did not look back at the warm, yellow light of the cabin. She set her face to the north, towards the wild, unmapped hills, and walked away from the only home her heart had ever known. Evelyn's discovery of the note the next morning was met with a single, sharp cry of such pure animal pain that it brought Luke running from the barn. He read the note, and the color drained from his face. He looked at Evelyn, who was now on her knees, the note clutched in her hand, her body racked with dry, soundless sobs. He had seen grief before. He had felt it, but this was something else. This was the sound of a soul being torn in half. In the days that followed, Evelyn became a ghost in her own home. She moved through the motions of living, but her eyes were vacant, her spirit absent. She wept until she had no more tears to give, leaving her in a state of hollow, aching emptiness. Her only solace was in writing. Every day, she would sit at the small table and write a letter to Clara. She wrote of the mundane details of the day. The cow had calved, the roof was leaking, and of the vast, gaping hole in her life. She wrote of her love, her sorrow, her regret. "My dearest Clara," she would begin, her hand shaking. "The sun rose again today, but I do not know why. It is a cruel trick. to bring light to a world that has gone dark. Luke is quiet. He watches me. I think he is afraid I will simply turn to dust and blow away. Perhaps I will. Where are you? Are you safe? Are you warm? I pray that you are. I pray that you know you are not forgiven. Because there was nothing to forgive. You are only loved. You are only missed. The letters piled up in a small wooden box, a stack of unspoken words, a testament to a love that had nowhere to go. Luke watched her, his own heart a heavy, leaden weight in his chest. His quiet, pragmatic solution had failed. His acceptance had not been enough to shield them from the world. Clara's sacrifice, meant to save them, had instead plunged them into a deeper, more profound misery. He saw Evelyn fading before his eyes, and he knew that if he did nothing, he would lose them both. The quiet, ordered life he had once craved now seemed like a barren, desolate landscape. He had agreed to this unconventional family, and he would not let it be destroyed by the small, frightened minds of his neighbors. One morning, after a week of this living death, he made a decision. He packed his saddlebags with provisions, cleaned his rifle, and saddled his strongest horse. "I'm going to find her," he said to Evelyn. It was not a question. It was a vow. Hope, a feeling so long absent it was almost painful, flickered in Evelyn's eyes. "Bring her home," she whispered. "Please, Luke, bring her home." Luke was a tracker. He knew the land. But Clara had been clever. The rain had washed away her initial trail. She had left no obvious signs. But Luke knew Clara. He knew her resourcefulness, her fierce independence. She would not have gone towards another town, another place of judgment. She would have gone to the wild places, the spaces in between. He rode for days, his search a painstaking process of elimination. He followed cold streams, scouted remote, abandoned trappers' cabins, and spoke to the few solitary prospectors he encountered in the high country. He followed a hunch, a whisper of a rumor from a fur trader about a lone woman seen heading towards the Ute territories in the foothills of the San Juan Mountains. It was a long shot, but it was the only trail he had. He found her in a place he never would have expected. It was a small, hidden valley, home to a small, displaced band of Ute people. They lived a quiet, nomadic life, far from the white settlements. And there, living among them, was Clara. He saw her from a ridge overlooking the valley. She was sitting by a stream, mending a fishing net alongside two older Ute women. She was thinner, her skin tanned by the sun, her hair braided in two simple plaits down her back. She wore a practical doeskin dress, and she moved with a quiet, settled purpose that told Luke she had not just been surviving here. She had found a place. She looked up, as if sensing his presence, her eyes scanning the ridge. Their gazes met across the distance. He rode down into the valley. The Ute people watched his approach with silent, cautious eyes, but no one moved to stop him. Clara stood as he dismounted, her face a mask of conflicting emotions, shock, fear, and a deep, guarded sorrow. "You shouldn't have come." "Luke," she said, her voice low. "I had to," he answered, his own voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. He took a step closer, and then another, until he was standing before her. He looked at her, at the strength and sadness in her eyes, and the words he had rehearsed in his mind for days dissolved. The truth of his heart, a truth he had only recently come to understand himself, was all that was left. He did something he had never done before in his life. He went down on one knee in the dirt, his hat held in his hands. He looked up at this fierce, proud, broken woman who had tried to save his family by destroying it. "When I sent for a bride," he said, his voice thick and uneven, "I thought I was just looking for a cure for loneliness. I was wrong. I was looking for a home. Evelyn came, and she brought a light with her. But that light, it didn't truly catch fire until it found you." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "Clara, I didn't just marry Evelyn.
In my heart, I married you, too. I married the whole complicated, difficult, beautiful truth of us. A home isn't a roof and four walls. It's the people you can't live without. And we cannot live without you." Tears were streaming down Clara's face. She looked from Luke's earnest, upturned face to the distant mountains, as if searching for an escape. But there was no escape from a truth this powerful. She slowly, hesitantly, reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder. "Get up, you fool," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "You'll ruin your trousers." Their return to town was a deliberate, unified act. They rode in not as a man with his wife and a disgraced neighbor, but as three people, side by side, Luke in the middle, Evelyn on his right, Clara on his left. Their faces were set, their posture erect. They were no longer hiding. The town, of course, noticed. Windows twitched. People stopped in the street to stare. The whispers began again, louder now, more venomous. Their brief, private peace was over. The confrontation they had all been dreading came in front of the mercantile. A man named Jebediah Smith, a rancher whose piety was as loud as his temper was short, blocked their path. He was the preacher's staunchest ally, a man who saw sin in every shadow. "Harrigan," he sneered, his eyes filled with a righteous, ugly zeal. "So you've brought your shame back with you. It's not enough you defile the holy institution of marriage in your own home. You have to parade your abomination in front of our good, God-fearing women and children?" Luke's hand went to the pistol on his hip. "Get out of my way, Jebediah." But Jebediah's eyes were on Evelyn. "As for you," he spat, taking a menacing step towards her, "you are a disgrace, a serpent sent from the east to poison our town." Luke moved so fast he was a blur. He stepped in front of Evelyn, shoving Jebediah back. "You will not speak to my wife that way." Jebediah stumbled, his face purpling with rage. He was not a man to be publicly shamed. His hand flew to his own gun. "No man shoves me." The world seemed to slow down. The shot cracked through the afternoon air, deafeningly loud. Evelyn screamed, but it wasn't Luke who had fallen. It was Jebediah, clutching his arm where Luke's bullet had grazed him. But in his fury, Jebediah had managed to fire his own pistol. Luke grunted, a sharp exhalation of pain, and staggered back, clutching his left shoulder. A dark, crimson stain began to spread across the fabric of his shirt. For a moment, the street was frozen in shock. Then, chaos erupted. But in the center of it, a new kind of order was born. Clara was at Luke's side in an instant, her face a mask of fierce concentration. She ripped a long strip of cloth from the bottom of her own petticoat. "Put pressure on it," she commanded Evelyn. Evelyn, her face white with terror, didn't hesitate. She pressed both of her hands firmly against Luke's bleeding shoulder, her touch desperate and steady. Luke leaned heavily on Clara, his face pale but his eyes clear. The three of them stood there in the dusty street, surrounded by the gawking, silent townspeople. Luke, wounded but standing, supported by Clara, his wound being tended by Evelyn. For the first time, they were a unit in the public eye, bound not by shame, but by crisis, loyalty, and a fierce, protective love. They were a family, forged in blood and defiance. Winter came, blanketing the land in a deep, cleansing snow. The silence that fell over the prairie was a peaceful one. The town still whispered, but their whispers could not penetrate the thick log walls of the cabin. The incident in the street had changed something. It had not won them acceptance, but it had earned them a grudging, fearful respect. They were a force to be reckoned with, a strange and resilient entity. The inside of the cabin was warm, the fire in the hearth a constant, cheerful presence. The evenings were quiet. Luke, his shoulder healed but still tender, would sit in his chair, oiling a harness. Evelyn would be nearby, her knitting needles clicking softly, and Clara would be on the other side of the hearth,
reading from her old Bible, her voice a low, soothing murmur in the quiet room. One evening, as a log in the fire shifted and sent a shower of sparks up the chimney, Luke reached out his good hand and let it rest on Clara's shoulder. She looked up from her book and smiled. A small, genuine smile. At the same time, Evelyn paused in her knitting and rested her head for a moment against Luke's knee. A simple, unspoken chain of touch, a quiet affirmation. They were not 2 in 1, they were 3. A chord, perfectly balanced. On the wall above the mantelpiece, in a simple wooden frame Luke had built, hung the white wedding dress. It was no longer a symbol of a broken promise or the beginning of a conventional marriage. It was an artifact, a relic of the journey that had brought 3 lonely, wandering souls together. It was the beautiful, strange, and sacred flag of their small, defiant country, a testament to the fact that in the wild, unforgiving West, a home was not a place you found, but a thing you had the courage to build. Thank you so much for listening to our story today. We're always so grateful to have you with us. Please, take a moment to comment below and let us know where in the world you're listening from. We'd love to connect with you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, From Wild West, and share your thoughts on Luke, Evelyn, and Clara's journey